And with that, welcome to this session on European security. I remember very well our last ESPAS conference, which took place on 12 and 13 November 2015. On 12 November, we had Gilles de Kerchove with us, the EU counterterrorism coordinator, who delivered remarks that I believe entailed a lot of foresight and which shook quite a few of us. On 13th of November, in my concluding comments at the ESPAS conference, I asked what would happen if Europe had a 9/11 style attack on its soil. That night, shortly before going to bed, I always check the news one last time just to see what's going on. And so I did that night, and I saw the headlines: bombs going off in Paris and hostage taking in the Bataclan concert hall. As you all know, in total, 130 people were killed and 368 injured. That was just a year ago. We have come a long way since then, but many measures have been taken, but society has not healed. Fears about radicalization, about using the internet to spread propaganda and mobilizing new recruits, about unspeakable acts of violence and aggression. All that is and will continue to be with us. How should policymaking react to this latent and very present threat? And what's the security outlook, both here in Europe and elsewhere? I'm delighted that we have with us an excellent panel to talk about one of the most pressing issues of our times. And I want to give particular thanks and recognition to Sir Julian King, Commissioner for the Security Union, who will address us in a few moments after the presentation. And that presentation will be delivered by two of Europe's foremost researchers on terrorism: Peter Neumann, Professor of Security Studies at King's College London, where he also serves as Director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. He is accompanied by his colleague, Dr. Shiraz Maher, the Deputy Director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. We will first hear from Peter and Shiraz and then from Commissioner King, as I just said. But before I hand over, I wanted to mention that you see in your program that Anja Kaspersen, Head of Strategic Engagement and New Technologies at the International Committee of the Red Cross, was supposed to be with us. Now, Anja had a very urgent private matter that prevents us from being with us today. But she very kindly sent a very brief, and I really mean brief, video that I want to share with you, also because it really brings in a global perspective. So let's listen to her for a minute before I call our panel up on stage.
Hi, my name is Anja Kaspersen, and I'm delighted to be here today with you virtually to share a couple of short remarks on the impact I see of new technologies on the global security regime. Geostrategic balances are shifting. We face new technological arms race with potentially destabilizing consequences. Rapid technological advances are making it cheaper and easier to develop new ways of causing harm at scale, and technologies previously only available to states are now available to non-state actors, groups, and individuals through new means of production, 3D printing, and open source platforms. This democratization of destruction is exemplified by recent cyber attacks on critical network systems, which are likely to become more commonplace. Decentralizing threats create an incentive for states to collaborate on designing effective responses to their shared challenges, and de-silo and de-stovepipe our systems and responses. But political systems and actors still assume a zero-sum approach to security. It is all too easy to concoct a frightening vision of the future. But how do we minimize risks and improve outcomes? We are indeed at a critical inflection point that will increasingly transform our lives in ways we struggle to understand, let alone control. There are no easy answers, but the first step is to acknowledge the risks and make greater effort to include all stakeholders, disciplines, and generations in an honest and informed conversation. We need to improve technological literacy among all the key decision makers, as we need to improve security and ethical knowledge and knowledge about the implications among technologists and entrepreneurs, and we need a mechanism to bring the two together. As a Nobel-winning physicist and tech optimist Dennis Gabor once put it several generations ago, the future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. Thank you so much, and best of luck with your discussions.
Let's give her a round of applause. For those of you who know me, you know I'm a digital optimist, but I have to say that my optimism is sometimes tested. And I have now, particularly in this job, sometimes seen a very dark side of technology and the internet. And with that, I just want to hand over now to Peter and Shiraz, who I believe have done groundworking work in this field, and we look forward to your presentation. Please come up on stage. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Anne, for the invitation. Thank you for listening to us, Julian. It's a great pleasure to be here. We want to be very brief. We've been, at ICSR, we've been looking at this particular threat of Islamic State and the jihadist movement for a number of years, and we've produced many different outputs. What we want to do in the 10 or 15 minutes that we have is to give you two snapshots of developments that we have recently looked at and that we think are significant. The one I'm going to talk about is what we call the crime-terror nexus, which is also the subject of an article that I think is in your map and that was published as part of the publication here. Because what we found was that a really surprising number, an astonishing number, in fact, of European recruits to ISIS, of people who have gone to Syria and Iraq to fight there, had previously been involved in quote-unquote ordinary criminal activity. This is something that you see across Europe, and it is indicating, at least to some extent, a changing profile of the people who have become involved in terrorism in Europe. If you look back 15 years ago, the quintessential example of people who became involved in what was then Al-Qaeda were people who were typically, according to a really important study that was done at the time, essentially young intellectuals looking for spiritual answers. 60% of Al-Qaeda recruits in 2004 were found to be university educated, often belonging to middle and upper classes. They were typical, the doctors and engineers of jihad, as they were sometimes described. And over 50% of them, of those that were employed, were in skilled employment. Now compare that to the people who have joined ISIS. This is according to the numbers provided by the German Federal Criminal Office of the people who have traveled to Syria. Only 12% of them university educated. 66% were known to police. 33%, a third of them, had criminal convictions. And of those who had criminal convictions, the average number of convictions was 7. So these were serial offenders. 25% were unemployed. And I think of all the Germans that have gone to Syria, only 1 or 2 had actually finished their university education. My apologies to the Danish. Somehow this country is missing from the map. But this is, in fact, a picture that you see all over Europe. In fact, in addition to Germany, the figures for Spain are 40% former criminals, 50% in Belgium, 60% and more in Norway, and 6% and more in Netherlands. So this seems to be something that is happening across the continent. So we started looking at this more systematically and sort of rushing through this in order to get across the main points. One important point is that it has really changed the way that people become radicalized. what we often see amongst former criminals who turn to terrorism, who become involved in ISIS, is what we have called the redemption narrative. You may ask yourself, why would it be interesting for a former criminal to become, say, an ISIS fighter? It is because at some points they do reflect on their experience. They do understand that what they have done is terrible, and they are seeking for a way to continue to do what they have done all the time, but to do it for a higher purpose. Here's an example of, in fact, a Danish fighter who said, I really do not know what's going to happen. Maybe I'm going to die there in Syria. So what? Because, you know, some people have died of my hands. This is a big problem when I meet Allah. It's not good enough just praying with all the shit I've done. I've got to try and make a difference. I think about Judgment Day. But at least I can say I went down there and did what I could. And this represents the story of many, many of the fighters that have become involved. It's also because a lot of these organizations are explicitly, in fact, legitimizing the use of crime. And while Laki, an old jihadist radical preacher, was doing so, French jihadist here, as an example, makes reference to the notion of the spoils of war. You know, people are being told you can steal from your enemies and it is okay. In fact, in the French language Islamic State magazine, we see people being encouraged to engage in crime, knowing that probably many of their recruits have pasts like that. And we also do see posters that explicitly appeal to that type of person and say, if you are a former gangster, please join us, because sometimes people with the worst pasts create the best futures. So we're seeing an explicit appeal to that sort of demography in the outreach. This is a big problem, of course, for prisons. Of the sample that we've created, 57% of the fighters with criminal pasts had been imprisoned. It is arguably the place where the two milieus, the criminal milieu and the jihadist milieu, are intersecting in the most intimate ways. 27% of those actually underwent their radicalization in prisons. Prison is important because people are vulnerable there, they are cut off from their social networks, and of course they encounter a potential jihadist recruiter. If you look, for example, at the Charlie Hebdo attacks, that entire plot was created, in fact, in a prison outside of Paris where they all met and maintained their relationships. Very briefly towards the end, the really important bit here is that this convergence between crime and terror creates the possibility and opportunities for skills transfers. What we're seeing all over Europe is that jihadists are now, for example, finding it easier to access weapons because they are utilizing the contacts they have had in the criminal milieu. They are finding it easier to stay under the radar. They are organized forged identity papers. They're organizing safe houses. Two attackers in Brussels, in the Paris-Brussels network, the pictures that they were using in their forged Belgian identity cards. And of course, we're seeing more brutality because a lot of the people, in fact, 2/3 of the people with criminal past had used violence before, and they're desensitized to the use of violence. And in almost all of the cases, the use of violence in the terrorist attacks is worse than the violence that had been used before. And it has a final implication, which is, of course, for the financing of terrorist activities. Crime is increasingly being used in order to finance terrorist plots, and this is where I go a little bit against traditional notions of countering terrorism finance. The typical discourse about countering terrorism finance is always about the international banking system, about tracing transactions that are perhaps sent from one place to the other. In fact, of all the plots that we have seen recently in Europe, none of these transactions would have shown up in the international banking systems because these acts were financed using crime, trading counterfeits, for example, selling drugs, or taking out fake consumer loans. And this leads me to my recommendations and conclusions. First, given this changing profile, we do have, to some extent, to rethink radicalization. You may have heard some of the stories about jihadists drinking and smoking and partying until a few days before the attacks. These were typically people who were criminals, who saw no contradiction between being a jihadist on the one hand and being a gangster on the other hand. The fact that someone continues to smoke and drink and party is not necessarily an indication anymore that that person is not a terrorist. We need to target all financial streams. If we want to counter terrorism finance, it's no longer enough to just counter stuff that moves from one bank account to the other. We have to consider, for example, countering petty crime as a form of countering terrorist finance. We need to become more proactive in sharing information. We found plenty of examples where intelligence services, for example, ignored information that was coming from agencies like customs, even though those agencies actually did have valuable information that came from seemingly criminal activities that then turned out to be terrorist. And we do encourage people to break down those silos and for ordinary police to work more closely together with counterterrorism police, because in almost all of these cases, it then turns out that suspects were known to police, albeit in a different capacity. And you do have to create new coalitions because information that is being held may not necessarily always be held by government authorities, but for example, also by the private sector or by local governments. This is one aspect that we think is significant, and Shiraz is now going to talk about the second aspect. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Peter, and thanks again for the invitation to be here. I'll just wait for the slides to get pulled up, but before I go into them and whilst they're being pulled up, Peter gave quite a specific example there of what we've been studying. Over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, ICSR studied the whole sort of, you could say, plethora of different things relating to the conflict in Syria and the security implications arising from there for Europe. And I'll do a slightly larger sort of 30,000 feet analysis of kind of what the issue is. One of the key things we've seen is this idea that we've had a large flow of foreign fighters go into Syria and Iraq over the last few years. It's really happened over about a 2 to 3 year period. Over the last 12 months, that flow has been diminished greatly. And we've had something like about 30,000 fighters in total, of which 20 to 25,000 have gone and joined up with the so-called Islamic State. Of that figure, something like 15% have been killed in combat. Around 35% returned or left the combat altogether, which leaves us with about 50,000, leaves us with 50%, of which there are 10 to 12,000 who are active combatants in this regard. Looking at the European picture then and what that means for Europe, that would mean somewhere in the region of 1,700 to 2,000 Europeans who remain active today based on this titration system, who we believe would be active today, fighting with Islamic State in its conflict in Syria and Iraq. To give a sense of the scale, this is a table that's put together by Thomas Hegghammer, a Norwegian academic, looking at largely Sunni foreign fighter mobilizations, irregular mobilizations over the last few decades. And what you see is that the scale of what has transpired is truly unprecedented. And over a time scale that, again, is largely unprecedented. So you have a rapid mobilization of a huge number of people in a very, very short and concentrated time period. As we're considering increasingly the idea of Islamic State losing territory, we want to, and it's obviously a desirable thing to see them lose territory in Mosul, for example. We're also looking to see what will happen in Syria around Raqqa. It's worth bearing in mind what the implications might be of a very sudden and rapid loss of territory for this organization, because whilst it continues to hold territory, roughly and essentially, you know where most of the people are, you know essentially, again, largely what is happening in that territory, and you're trying to contain and mitigate against the radiation coming after there. But as it sort of gets diminished, there are a number of scenarios that will happen. A large number, of course, will die in the campaign to try and retain that territory in the first place, and in order to halt the incoming forces. There will be a hugely revanchist campaign, so a campaign that will be waged as an insurgency to reclaim Mosul. This was the experience, of course, that the United States and Britain and others learned when they invaded Iraq in 2003. It's one thing to put your tanks into Baghdad or Mosul. It's another thing to hold them. So you will see a large number of fighters get involved in that revanchist campaign, staying in the conflict zone. You may see a number of them moving into neighboring territories, and again, we've seen that in the past with previous conflicts. So when we think of the turbulences in Afghanistan after September the 11th and the 2001 toppling of the Taliban, then Pakistan really became the primary country in which a lot of these people got absorbed. It was the sort of garrison town where essentially people sat for a while and worked out what their next move was going to be. And again, we saw that in the past as well in the 1980s when the conflict against the Soviet Union came to an end. Lots of the fighters went to Sudan, regrouped, and worked out what they were going to do. And the important thing to bear in mind with this is that it doesn't happen quickly. So even if Mosul, in theory, were to completely collapse tomorrow and it's been sealed off, there is no longer an Islamic State presence, the idea that this begins to wrap up shortly thereafter is a misnomer. This is still very much a crisis and a problem whose embers will be with us in a way that we should consider them over decades, not in terms of even years or weeks or months. So you see a lot of them moving to neighboring countries. It's our opinion that we don't see many of them traveling to sort of other conflict zones that are far sort of flung. So a lot of people talk about Libya and the idea that maybe if Islamic State diminishes in terms of its control and authority in Syria and Iraq, you might see Libya spring up. But we've seen no evidence to suggest large transfers or flows of people from that region to Libya or indeed to North Africa more generally. We also don't see how it's possible for large numbers to move. So you may get the odd individuals moving across, but we don't see anything of any volume or significance in that regard. And then you will, of course, see some return home. Of those returning home, some will be disillusioned. Some will have decided to have given up the fight and sort of decided that they've done wrong. But of course, a proportion of them as well will be dangerous. They will be coming back with plans and visions to carry out terrorist activity and atrocities at home. So there's some scenarios that we've considered in this regard. As I said, they will... you see here, they will could potentially join other rebel groups within the region. We have seen some of them moving towards what was Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the official al-Qaeda group in the region, now known as Jabhat al-Fatah Sham. So there has been some degree of flow going that way, but again, it's largely not happening on a significant scale. It's happening on localized levels between local commanders. There's no institutional policy to do this, and indeed, you could say, for want of a better term, Al-Qaeda, if we call them that for sort of sake of all their various name changes, there's bad blood, a lot of bad blood between them and Islamic State. So it doesn't make it too easy in that regard. As I said before, we've seen some of the previous provinces mentioned in some of the propaganda, but we haven't seen anything empirically that would support the view that this is happening in a significant or meaningful way. We have seen large numbers of people return home already, and as I said, part of the thing we need to be thinking about is, particularly on the European scale, is how we begin to receive these people. And it's not just, of course, the fighters themselves who will be returning home, with whom necessarily we look at them through a sort of law and order prism, trying to prosecute them, send them to prisons and so on, but mental health services might be appropriate in a lot of cases. And of course, the issue that has not been discussed a lot is that a lot of children were taken over into these combat theaters. And what do you do with a mother who returns with a 7-year-old child who spent the last 3 years watching live executions and beheadings in Raqqa? And what is the process in place at a European level to begin to reintegrate these children, to desensitize them to the horrors of what they've seen and the combat stresses that they have endured? So that's definitely something worth considering. As I say, hasn't been thought about a lot at this stage. And it's also worth mentioning, of course, a lot of Europeans have traveled out there, got married out there, and had children out there, which raises all kinds of jurisdictional questions as well about citizenship and whose children they really are and which countries have authority and responsibility for them. And then finally, as I mentioned before, they will probably move to neighboring countries, Lebanon to a lesser extent, but Turkey. Peter and I have been out there a few times on field trips, and we've noticed a growing band, particularly down in the border towns, so in the southern Turkish areas, where people are gathering, they're regrouping, and they're essentially contemplating what their next steps are. And I think it's safe to say they don't have a coherent or a well thought out plan at this stage. They are literally living day to day and working out what the big picture is, what the strategy will be for them. And again, it's worth trying to think that left alone as they were in Sudan, that's when the recalibration of hostilities began to focus on the United States and led very slowly over a number of years that road to 9/11. So it's worth thinking about what we might be doing with Turkey as well in terms of trying to deal with this ever-growing community of disillusioned, disenchanted, and maybe fighters who are just waiting for the next opportunity, how we can begin to disengage them and to de-radicalize them in this forward-thinking way. So by way of conclusion, historically we've seen, as I mentioned, foreign fighters, they will largely die, and that's their overriding aim. They'll stay in the conflict zone to wage a revanchist campaign. They'll go elsewhere, return home, but more likely will begin to gather in neighboring countries. And Turkey is the primary country of concentration that we think is significant. Of the European contingent, I think it's safe to say a large number of them will die. They tend to be sent to the front lines during crisis moments. We saw that in Kobani, for example. Large numbers of Europeans were sent to the front lines and were killed there, primarily because they don't tend to have military experience before they've arrived in Syria and Iraq, and therefore they're good cannon fodder. It's worth sending them to the front and keeping your better fighters from the Chechen region, from the Balkans, and so on, who have some degree of combat experience. You save them for the better fights. As I say, we will see some of them returning home, and the long-term aim for us, and something that we're beginning to look at increasingly at ICSR, is what might be the best strategies now to try and disengage and disentangle these people over the long run so that they don't become a threat in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter and Shiraz. As last time when you came to the EPSC, it's sufficiently scary, but also, of course, extremely insightful, especially this link that you make between common crime and terrorism. It is now a particular pleasure to finally call on Commissioner King. Before you come up, I want to say we purposefully call on you last because I wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on what you heard from Peter and Shiraz, and perhaps it is also something that you might wish to respond to. Of course, as the first ever commissioner for the Security Union, you have such a formidable role to play. And so we're very eager to hear about your thoughts about foresight, anticipation, and global trends in the field of security. I have to say, I am personally delighted that this post was created, and even more delighted that it was given to you. Commissioner King, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and I'm very conscious that I speak in front of some real experts here. I will try and draw on one or two of the things that you spoke about. I'll also try and pick up what I caught at the end of the last session as well. So I wasn't expecting to be here. It wasn't in the script, but I am delighted that President Juncker chose to use the occasion of my arrival to create this new portfolio, as you said, and to encourage me working with many colleagues across the Commission to try and pull together and to give a little bit of a push to the work that we're doing on building an effective and sustainable security union. Because, as we all know, a series of unfortunate events and the kind of threats that you've just been talking about have led, not surprisingly, to a renewed demand from citizens across the European Union that we do a bit more in this area. The core of the security union work is around countering terrorism, but also countering cyber and serious organized crime and the links between those three pillars. I'll speak mostly about the first, countering terrorism, responding to the comments that have just been made, but I do want to say something more briefly also about cyber. So In many of these issues, the member states and member state authorities are inevitably in the front line. But as we've just heard, and as you know, and as the investigations following the horrible attacks in Paris and Brussels, to name just those, show, these are pan-European challenges. And therefore, I think it is absolutely right that we should be looking hard at what we can do at the European level better to help and support the member states as they try and grapple with these problems. Your conference has a sort of 10 to 15 year time horizon. I have to say, I'm a bit more focused on a 2 to 3 year time horizon because we need to try and speed up our actions, obviously in the context of reflection on longer term trends, but we can't wait to reinforce our action. And I see it in the counterterrorism effort really around 3 or 4 areas. There is more that we can and should do around legislation and regulation. Not a huge amount of regulation, but there are some areas where it's needed and it can work, where we're tackling the means that terrorists have resort to, and when we're trying to use as effectively as possible the knowledge that we have about who is coming in and out of the Union. The means. Tackling the means isn't always sort of rocket science. Sometimes it's just hard work. So the means that terrorists have used in recent attacks can be quite basic. Ingredients that you can buy in the supermarket that when you mix them together can make explosives. This isn't academic. Attacks that unfortunately took place or have been foiled in France and Germany were exactly using those kind of explosives. Or it's weapons that unfortunately are too readily available across Europe, or in some cases, it's a knife or it's a vehicle. There are some things that we can do to make it harder for people to get hold of the means they're using to do those kinds of attacks. So we are cracking down on these things called explosive precursors, the stuff that you can buy in the supermarkets and mix together. And we're encouraging member states to do what we've all agreed would be the right thing to do and have really effective legislation for tracing. There is some very, for me, exciting research that was sponsored by the European Union, which we now need to try and encourage others to pick up, whereby you can actually neutralize the ingredients so that the fertilizers still work as fertilizers, but you can't mix them to create explosives. So there's some really practical things that you can do. On weapons, there are too many weapons around in Europe. Somebody told me that in Europol, they've got a test for new recruits when they arrive in The Hague. They're asked to go out and purchase a weapon illegally. The latest record is under 1 hour. There are too many weapons in free circulation. So as well as cracking down on illegal trafficking, which we're doing, including with partners and our near abroad, including in the Balkans, and I want to take this opportunity to salute the cooperation we've got with some of those partners. We also need to think hard about how to regulate effectively access to weapons in our society. Now, I know this is controversial. We're pursuing a discussion at the moment with the co-legislators in the European Parliament on a revised regulation around access to firearms. But it is not about penalizing the legitimate use. It's not about being hard on hunters or sport shooters or reservists in some of our countries. It is about finding ways of taking military-grade, automatic Kalashnikov-type firearms off the streets. And I think we should continue to do that. Knowing who is coming in and out of the European Union, if we're going to keep our doors open, which I think we all are committed to, then it behoves us to know as much as we can, reasonably, about who's coming in and out. So we are taking a series of steps to try and make the best use of the existing information that is available in a network of law enforcement and judicial databases, always respecting the highest standards of data protection. And we're thinking about whether there are some further steps that we can take, either in creating new sources of information or in more effectively using the information we've got. So you will see proposals for new measures. There's a proposal on the table for an entry-exit system that would check third country nationals coming in and out in more detail. And earlier on today, as you may have seen, we have tabled a proposal for a European-style ESTA, that is a pre-clearance system for third country, for non-visa third country nationals. Again, we're going to have to explain how this is going to work, how it's not restricting people's right to travel, quite the contrary. It's going to facilitate the ease with which they can be processed at the borders when they arrive, but it will allow us to know a little bit more about who is coming in and out of our territory. So there's work we need to do about knowledge and making the best use of knowledge. There's some very hard work we need to do about implementation, that is doing the stuff that we've all agreed we should be doing. So I mentioned explosive precursors. Lots of member states have put those measures in place, but some haven't. And so we have taken, for the first time, infringement actions in this area against a small number of member states, not because we want to cause them trouble, still less because we're going to generate some big fines to raise funds. It's not about that. It's about encouraging member states, working with the member states, by shining a light on some of the things that we've all agreed should happen but haven't yet happened. And one of the larger implementation challenges that we face is putting into practice something that was agreed earlier this year after a long discussion, which is a passenger name records system. A number of you will have followed this debate. It's now agreed we're going to do this thing. We're going to do it across Europe for flights coming in and out and for intra-EU flights, in the same vein of knowing more about who is coming in and out and who is traveling around our shared space. It's not due to come into force until spring 2018, so there's time, but it is very complicated. It requires an investment in an IT infrastructure. A number of member states have got it already, more are working on it, but 10 or 11 member states have yet to start. And so we are going to work hand in hand with those member states to make sure that they are in a position by spring 2018 to do this effectively, because it's a system that will be as strong as its weakest link. So implementation. And the third thing I want to talk about is our excellent agencies. We have some fantastic EU agencies, some of them well-known, Europol, Eurojust, some slightly less well-known but doing very important work, something called EU LISA, EU CERT in the IT field. They can work with member states to help and support them to take some of these steps that I've been talking about. We need to think, and this goes to some of the things that in particular Peter was saying, we need to think about countering radicalization. And that is countering radicalization on the internet, because this is an area where Daesh are strong, using the internet to spread their propaganda and try and reach people who might be susceptible to being radicalized, which means working very closely with the internet service providers. There's some stuff that's illegal, that clearly should come down. There's quite a lot of stuff up there that isn't strictly speaking illegal, but is clearly pretty pernicious and nasty. And we want to work with the internet service providers to encourage them, according to their own rules and procedures, to take that kind of material down. There's a bit of Europol called the Internet Referral Unit that has been doing that, has done 12,000 referrals over the last 12 months, and I'm glad to say in 9 out of 10 cases, material, when identified, is taken down. That's good, but there are hundreds of thousands of such messages up on the internet. So we need to significantly scale up that effort, and we're going to be working, there's a meeting beginning of December, as hard as we can to encourage the internet service providers working with us to scale that effort up. But there's another very important element to our work to counter radicalization, and that is the work in our communities. And there, I personally am persuaded that there can't be one sort of pan-European answer. What works is local civil society grassroots action. The people we're trying to reach very often are almost by definition alienated from authority. So it's not going to be the state, still less someone arriving from Brussels who's going to be effective in reaching out to them. What we can do at a European level is help and support that network across Europe of grassroots civil society actors through funding and through animating a network that allows them to come together to learn from each other and support each other, to test things that have worked in one place and see whether they might work in another. And I'm very glad to inherit something called the Radicalization Awareness Network that is doing that, that is working with young people, that is working with frontline exponents of dealing with prisoners, ex-prisoners, other at-risk groups. And they bring a lot of expertise, but they can also learn from the kind of expertise that we have here on the stage. And I should just note that in passing at a meeting of the Radicalization Awareness Network that we had here in Brussels last week, it was practitioners, civil society practitioners, who raised the question of children and families potentially returning from Iraq and Syria, and started a debate about what lessons they had that they could share. For example, in 1 or 2 cases, from experience of dealing with families who'd been rescued from cult-like activities. Clearly, it's not exactly the same thing, but people are reaching for practical examples that they can use to learn from. I think that's fantastically important work, which we should continue to help and support. And we need to do work to reinforce our critical infrastructure, to make ourselves a harder target, and to make sure that if the worst does happen, as it did, of course, at Brussels Airport, just up the road here, we're able to respond quickly, to help the victims, and eventually to rebuild in a more secure way. And there, again, I think at the European level, we can help support that work by creating the networks so that the experts can get together and learn from each other, and with some carefully targeted funding and indeed some carefully targeted research, which takes you a little bit more into the prospective field. I just want to say 2 words about cyber, if I can, because it's a different sort of threat, but it is also a very real threat to us all. Cyber crime is growing very fast. If over the last few years it's grown, the value of cybercrime, the assessed effect of cybercrime on our businesses has grown 4-fold. And it is set to grow again by 4 times, looking forward to 2019. And by 2019, it is assessed that globally this will be costing business somewhere around 2 trillion euros. So it's a massive drag on business. But as well as the cyber criminals, there are politically motivated cyber groups. And I think we just have to be conscious of that. In fact, the hierarchy of action in the cyber world goes, and this surprised me when I learnt it, goes from the bottom, jihadi extremist terrorist activity. They use it for propaganda, but they haven't yet got very good at using it to actually as an instrument to pursue their fight against our society. Next up, the cyber criminals, who, as I've just said, are doing a tremendous amount of economic damage. But the most sophisticated proponents of attacks in the cyberspace are the politically motivated, often state-sponsored groups. And they are doing some quite radical things. In 2015, they took down a French TV network, TV5 Monde. Also in 2015, they broke into the European Parliament IT networks and tried to go from the European Parliament into other networks of the institutions. In early 2016, they broke into the CDU party network in Germany. And in just a few months ago, they broke into the Democratic National Convention network and published some of the material. In most of those cases, IT experts source those attacks. It's not me saying this, it's IT experts who've said it publicly before, to Russian-linked state-sponsored groups. And I think as we continue to develop a digital single market, as we push the benefits that can flow from data that you were discussing at your last session, as we seek to increase our interconnectedness through the Internet of Things and otherwise, we just need to be conscious of this flip side, and we need to factor in the security dimension, because otherwise we are leaving ourselves open to attack. So that's quite a lot. I'm sorry to cover it in quite a scattergun way, but those are the sort of issues that we are seeking to pursue in building an effective and sustainable security union. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Commissioner. And it's very impressive what in your short tenure you have already all accomplished and brought underway. We have a little bit of time for questions or comments. Who would like to go first? Okay, Angela, then go ahead. In the back, please introduce yourself.
Angela Wilkinson. I'm reminded of a conversation I had at the World Economic Forum many years ago, which came from non-European and non-Western constituencies who said, the challenge with the West is that you're not shocked often enough. And because it's been so stable for a long time, you're not psychologically able to deal with these inevitable surprises. And I wondered if there is something around not just the intervention to make people, to tackle these issues, but something around the psychology of societies in the Western world around this issue.
Thank you. Very good point, sort of around intellectual and psychological resilience. Yes, if we can have the microphone here in the front for Heather, please. And please, Heather, also introduce yourself.
Thank you. Heather Graby from Open Society European Policy Institute. Thank you for that very wide-ranging view of the landscape. When we look at it all together, these kinds of measures should sound reassuring to citizens, but there is a danger that by focusing on security, you feed the politics of fear. So I'm very curious as to what you think there would be the right political strategy to send the message to Europeans that states can deliver on these things, it's not hopeless, and also that counter-radicalization is not necessarily counterproductive. As we've seen in the case of the UK Prevent programme, it can backfire. It can set communities against each other. It can sow mistrust in healthcare settings, in education. What can be done at EU level to make sure that doesn't happen?
Very good. I think these are two excellent questions. Peter, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I want to respond to the first question, which raised an important but perhaps obvious point, because sometimes I'm being asked, why do we care about this issue so much? Aren't more people dying in bathtubs or in traffic accidents every year than in acts of terrorism? And that is true. Statistically speaking, terrorism is not a major cause of death. But that's also not the point of terrorism. The point of terrorism, the purpose behind terrorism is to terrorize. It is, in fact, if you want, a psychological way of warfare. And that's why terrorism is not so much necessarily about the numbers of people you kill, but it is about the political effects you create. And unfortunately, what we've seen in Europe already over the past 2 years is not only that a significant number of people have died, but that also our societies have become polarized to a very significant extent. And that is something that I worry about as much as about the numbers of people who die in terrorist incidents. That we're seeing in a number of European countries, people on the populist right are instrumentalizing the terrorist attacks that are being carried out by people who are jihadists, and that we're seeing extremists from all ends of the spectrum almost egging each other on. And that's why it's so important that when we communicate with publics, we tell them that the most important thing to do as a response to terrorist attacks is not to change their attitudes and behaviors towards, for example, people of Muslim descent, to behave towards them in exactly the same way as they had behaved before, because what ISIS wants to achieve is precisely for the rest of society to then treat people with suspicion, with mistrust, for fears to be sown, and for the center of society that allows you to reconcile different types of identity, for that center of society to become narrower and narrower. And so I totally agree with you, and I think it's an important point that we have to be aware of the fact that ultimately terrorism is a psychological method of warfare, and what it is psychologically that the terrorists want to do to us. They want to change our societies, and they want to change our attitudes towards pluralism and towards people in our countries.
Before we go to you, Shiraz, it just occurred to me, having lived both through the Brussels lockdown and the terrorist attack in March, it was interesting how being in Brussels after the Brussels lockdown, even though nothing actually happened, we were sort of paralyzed for weeks and canceled events. And then when the attack actually happened in March, the city actually sprung back to, I wouldn't say normal, but really proved quite resilient. And so I just wanted to mention that. Shiraz.
Thank you. Well, I'd largely reiterate Peter's comments in relation to your question. But I thought it was interesting you were saying we've had it so stable for so long. I think instability is coming. Donald Trump is here. We're Brexiting. I think instability is very much going to be part of the landscape now. In relation to the latest question here at the front, I think there's two aspects to sort of looking at a sort of pan-European response to some of the issues of radicalization and counter-radicalization. With regards to, you mentioned Prevent, for example, that sort of soft power element, I actually think it's harder to have a strategy across Europe that could be implemented by at sort of transnational level, because in a lot of those cases what you find is highly localized issues that are driving the radicalization of individuals. And so the experience of a young British Muslim is not the experience of a young French Muslim or a young Belgian Muslim or a German Muslim. And in fact, if you look at Britain, it's actually quite an outlier. They tend to be educationally achieving better. They tend to be financially and economically better off than their European counterparts. So in Europe, the picture is slightly more, you could say stereotypical, where it's undereducation, slightly more economically impoverished. But in Britain, it's slightly bizarre. They've actually been winners in their communities and yet have chosen to go. So I think the soft power element probably requires more localized and targeted solutions at those local levels, and taking into account the national character of the country we're talking about, and of course the dynamics and the demographic composition of the Muslim community in that country. So again, in Britain, it's largely people from the Indian subcontinent. In France, it's different North Africans and so on. But I think in terms of the sort of slightly harder element, in terms of a legislative capacity, what you might be doing, disrupting travel, for example, preventing people coming back, that kind of thing, then it strikes me as there's a very clear and obvious need to have a pan-European approach at the harder end, at the legislative and law enforcement end, that is doing those things, because clearly people are moving cross-border when they're seeking to engage in clandestine activity.
Very interesting. Commissioner King, over to you with perhaps an add-on question about the fear. How do people respond to you when you go places? With great fear, or what do people say to you?
They're always very charming, of course, like you are. No, but I just wanted to say I very much agree with both sets of comments, and I think part of the challenge is to get this mix right. There are some areas where a pan-European approach is definitely needed, and there are other areas where we have to be very sensitive to local circumstances. Even there, I think there are things we can do in a networked way to support local actors, as I was trying to say. On how do we deal with fear, well, I don't know if there's any easy answer to that, but being conscious of the challenge is important. So there is, for example, there is a temptation to conflate migration and the issues connected with rising to that challenge on the one hand, and terrorism and the problems of terrorism on the other. And I think that the first thing we can do, and this we can do as individuals as well as collectively, is to not accept that kind of conflation. Because to conflate migration and the challenges connected with that, with terrorism and problems of terrorism, is basically to do Daesh's propaganda work for them in exactly the same way as Peter was saying. So we should push back against any attempt oversimplistically to conflate those two challenges, two sets of different challenges. Now, we must do that, of course, without being naive. There are documented cases of people who wish us ill, motivated by Daesh, either coming to or coming back to the EU using routes that are used by migrants and refugees. And that's why I think it's very important that we have taken steps and that we communicate effectively about the steps we have taken to reinforce controls at our borders. Because it's by saying credibly that we have now got in Greece and in Italy and in other points of arrival, as effective as we can manage, controls to document, identify, interview people who give, for whatever reason, cause for concern, that we're able to break the easy conflation of migration and terrorism.
Very good. Before we go back, can I just show of hands, who thinks we'll have another major attack in, let's say, the next 6 months? Well, I'd say you've done a pretty good job.
I'm not sure that's the best way to test. I think we all know. That if you do a survey of the threat levels across the European Union, in too many countries, they are either at the highest or one step down in the slightly different, depending on which country you're talking about, gradations of threat level. No one should be in any doubt, and this isn't to fan fear, but it's to avoid sounding in any way naive or complacent about this. Nobody should be in any doubt that there is a very, very high level of threat. And there are people in Iraq and in Syria who are seeking to do us harm. And it behoves us, therefore, to do the best we can to discourage them, to cut them off from the means, to cut them off from support structures, to stop people becoming radicalized, to try and stop people from traveling to and from, and to use as effectively as we can the information that we have available to counter those threats.
Very good. Thank you so much, Commissioner. And also to you, Peter, and Shiraz. Commissioner mentioned time horizon of about 2 to 3 years, which is natural because it's within the mandate of this commission. We're speaking about global trends 2030. I mean, how will terrorism evolve? I'd just be curious what you see. Is it going to continue this way, or do you see anything changing dramatically? I'd just be very interested. But you also wanted to respond to what the Commissioner just said. Go ahead,
yes,
Peter.
And also to your question, if your question had been, will there be an attempt to carry out a very significant attack, I would have certainly raised my hand. Of course, we know that there have been attempts that luckily have been prevented. I'm pretty sure there will be more attempts, even including in the next 6 months. And I think it is, of course, understandable to say we should not respond with fear. But what I have observed in 3 countries in which I've lived, in Germany, in Britain, and in America, is it's always the same. It's, you know, a terrorist attack happens, everyone is in panic mode, everyone is running around, you see a terrorist behind every mosque, and there's an overreaction. And then if nothing happens for a couple of months, people say, as in the case of Germany, for example, last year, Der Spiegel did a big cover story, The Terror Lie. It wasn't anything after all. We were misled. It's not happening every week. We have to accept there's not going to be an attack every week. Probably, hopefully not. But there is a very high terror threat level, and we have to do the right things in order to prevent that and to prepare ourselves for that. And it is not right also to tell publics that there's nothing to be worried about. There are things to be worried about, but equally that doesn't mean we should panic all the time. I think a sensible, reasonable, empirically based reaction to the threat is the best we can do for our societies. In terms of what's going to happen, I've been taking part in these Terrorism 2030, 2025 conferences for many years, and I can tell you when we did these conferences in 2009, 2010, all these brilliant experts, and I'm talking about myself, of course, including myself, did not foresee any of what was happening for the past 5 years. It came as a big surprise to a lot of us because no one foresaw the Arab Spring, no one foresaw the implosion of the Middle East, the Syrian civil war, the extent to which foreign fighters were being attracted, the rise of the caliphate. All of that was something that we did not foresee. Something that people have been predicting for 15, 20 years is the rise of cyber terrorism, which by and large has not happened. And I think it might happen at some point, but it might not. And it is, to me, to some extent, a puzzle why terrorists haven't used that particular mode of attack more than they have, but they haven't. CBRN is a big topic, and I think that with ISIS or Daesh, we now have a group that both has the intention and to some extent the capability to do that. So we might see attempts to make that happen. But beyond that, I think largely, speaking over the decades, terrorists have actually been surprisingly fairly conservative in terms of the tactics that they have employed. A colleague of mine once did a survey, and he found that 98% of terrorist attacks consist of 3 tactics: hostage takings, assassinations, and bombings. And I think those will continue to be the main methods of attacks in various different forms.
Can I just quickly follow on from Peter's point as a sort of complementary rejoinder? I think one of the things we've seen over the last sort of 18 to 24 months as well in Europe has been this sense that when we looked at terrorism traditionally, we thought of these highly sophisticated plots that required a great deal of planning and financial outlay. So September the 11th requires a tremendous amount of planning and sophistication. Even scale that back, the Madrid bombings or the London 7/7 attacks in 2005 had a degree of sophistication to them. And what we've seen in France in particular is 2 things. One is to use ordinary items, such as a truck to mow people down, so an ordinary everyday thing, you can still achieve a huge death count. So he ended up killing more people than the 7/7 attacks achieved. And I was really delighted to hear you talking a lot about guns, because I think that's the other thing that we've seen in Florida, in France, and so on, is that guns tend to kill far more people than a bombing, and then a bomb will use. So there's been this demonstration. I don't think it's a sort of proof of concept, but there's been this demonstration that using less sophisticated means can still achieve a high death count and cause mass panic and achieve all of the kinds of things that terrorists and terrorism wants to achieve, as Peter was saying. And so that sort of, as it were, for want of a better term, sort of dumbing down of terrorist tactics presents a huge challenge to authorities, but also a challenge to all of us, because it's harder to detect, yet still has a devastating consequence.
And Commissioner also wanted to say something, and then we'll come back to you, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I agree with both sets of those comments. But I just wanted to come back to one thing that you mentioned earlier in the presentations about financing, because I don't disagree, but I want to just respond to this suggestion that because we're not talking about moving large amounts of money around, maybe following the money isn't as useful as you assume. Following the attacks in Paris and in Brussels, in cooperation with Europol, the French and Belgian authorities provided information that was used to cross-check against the terrorist finance tracking system, and it generated literally multiple hundreds of leads. So even if it's only moving small amounts of money around, you can still use terrorist finance tracking methodology to supplement your investigations into attacks like that. So I don't think we should lose sight of the usefulness of that kind of approach. That said, we also have to adjust and adapt as those people who are seeking to do us harm use new methods. And they are certainly using new methods of raising funding linked to crime, but also linked to trade in plundered cultural goods. Some groups with roots in Africa trade in wildlife. There's every form of monetarizing their actions apparently is worth investigating on their part, and we need to be ready to adapt our response accordingly.
And let me add also the darknet and cryptocurrencies, because I think it's not right that everything goes through normal bank accounts. Go ahead, Peter.
And maybe I was a bit hard on the banks, but the slide said targeting all streams of finance, and that continues to include the banking system, but we need to perhaps think about it, as you said yourself, in a broader and more comprehensive way. Just one sentence on what Shiraz said, which is really important. There is evidence of, basically, some academics call it a contagion effect or terrorist learning. Basically, if something works, if something is seen to be working, other people will start imitating it. And after Nice, the horrible attack in Nice, up until that point, a lot of people that both Shiraz and I are following on a day-to-day basis were skeptical of the idea that you could kill a lot of people with a car. But Nice demonstrated in a horrible way that you can actually create more damage by driving a truck into a crowd of people than the entire Brussels attacks. It killed more than twice as many people. And we've seen Daesh promote this type of attack, particularly after the Nice attacks, because it demonstrated to have worked. So if you ask me, what do I expect to see in the next 6 or 12 months, I would expect to see some people trying to imitate precisely that, because from their point of view, it has worked.
Look, it's a fascinating discussion. My colleagues in the back are gesturing to cut me off. Before I do so, I want to give each one of you 20 seconds to just leave us with something that you think we should keep in mind. We start with you, Peter. 20 seconds or less.
Well, I've already basically used all my set pieces here. But
What would you prioritize?
Well, I would say, whatever happens, I think the motto of Global Trends 2030 is very important, and the number 2030 is also right, because what we've learned from terrorist waves in the past is that they are generational waves. And one thing we must not make is the mistake to think that when ISIS is defeated in Syria and Iraq, that ISIS is therefore defeated, because a lot of the people will return, turn up in other conflicts, and in many ways, the consequences of what has happened over the past 5 years are only now starting to materialize. So this will keep us preoccupied for a long time.
So a generational challenge. Shiraz.
To follow on from Peter's point, if it is a generational challenge and we're fighting ISIS in this militaristic way out in that region, I think for Europe and for Europeans, what the challenge is going to be is ultimately one of social cohesion. That, to my mind, seems to underlie all of this. People have lots of different trajectories and pathways into terrorism, into violent extremism, but when you strip it all away and you look at sort of the common denominators, social cohesion, better integration, having people who are more invested in their home societies and countries, seems to me to be the greatest point of resilience. And I think it's one that, as we've sort of built a European consensus since the Second World War of the last, 50, 60, 70 years, it's not something we've done particularly well with minorities, and I think it's something we need to think about how we do better.
Very good point. Thank you, Shiraz. Commissioner?
We haven't compared notes beforehand, I promise you. But I think we need to work hard on all the things that we've been discussing, but the area we have to work hardest on is countering radicalization.
Very good. So please give a warm round of applause to our panelists.